Our keynote for today, Doug Buell. But before I do that, I want to take care of some management pieces. As you've been told a couple of times, at about 11 o'clock, you're going to be dismissed from here, and you're going to go into working groups, which are organized by content area. Some of those groups are rather large. And we will leave it up to you in your content areas to decide if you want to divide and conquer, meaning that you might want to plan a couple of lessons with people doing different things, if you want to stay together as a whole group, if you want to work independently. All of those decisions are up to you. We want the hour to be as productive as possible for you in thinking about how you would actually immediately implement the gradual release of responsibility in your classroom. And remember what I said to you earlier, even if you say to yourself, I already do that, you probably don't. So we want you to be very intentional about it. You are going to exit this space and go back to those tables where you signed in, and you're going to see a number of handouts there again. You're going to see an evaluation form, which we would ask that you complete at some point before you leave this building and put back out on those tables. That's very important to us. We do look at them and adjust accordingly. We also will have a handout that has all of the room assignments on it so that you can see. You'll have to find your content area and your name and see where you're supposed to be. We are on 2 floors in this building. We're on the red floor, which is this floor right here. And we're on the green floor. No, we're on the blue floor. Blue's right, thanks. We're on the blue floor, which is the 3rd floor, the sky floor. In addition to finding the handout that says where you are, you will also see a map of the school. For those of you who aren't familiar with the school, there will be a map available to you. There are lots of high school teachers here who can help shepherd you where you need to go. So an evaluation that we ask that you fill out. Grab the form that tells you where you need to go. Grab a map if you need it. And then the 4th thing that's out there is, as I said earlier, a blank copy of the lesson plan design if you want to grab one, but you have one in the packet that we gave you. Okay? When Doug is done, we're going to show you a quick video. It's about 5 minutes. And as soon as that video's over, we just ask that you hop up and go. Okay? So, it is my pleasure to introduce Doug Buell to you. Doug is, in the state of Wisconsin and nationally, considered one of the finest experts in the field of literacy, K-12. But we're also very lucky that Doug has a good lens on and a deep understanding of adolescent literacy. Doug was a veteran teacher at East High School. 33 years at East High School. He knows what it's like to be in a high school classroom or secondary classroom. He knows what it's like to implement good ideas in instruction with kids. So he's going to take us through some more critical learning pieces today. Remember that this is just the start of a good journey. Okay? So please give a round of applause for Doug.
Following this kind of rock star sort of analogy that the day was initiated on, I would like to then, since you mentioned the Rolling Stones, I would like to assume the persona of Keith Richard for this morning. And if in any way you find my comments rambling and incoherent, just read my autobiography. You'll know why. And I think it's all downhill from here. I've got a number of pieces that are interesting pieces to fit together as you kind of think through what is unfolding with the initiatives that were started off this morning. As it was mentioned, my teaching experiences were centered at Madison East High School. I'm an East Sider. My kids were East Siders. My wife was an East Sider. Her dad was an East Sider. And sadly, some of you out here are also former East Siders and had to deal with me at some point in your storied pasts as well. I'm sorry I have to resurface in your life, but that's just how it goes. I had a number of different roles that I think influence the perceptions that I'm bringing to you. I was hired as a social studies teacher, so when I started teaching at East, my majors were history and political science, so clearly that influences some part of my thinking. It's an interesting lens because most people who do what I do come from English language arts backgrounds or often elementary backgrounds, and I don't. I come from a different discipline when I look at these issues, and that, I think, sometimes causes me to look at some of these issues somewhat differently than the way my language artsy colleagues look at it. I think that's one thing. The fact that I got laid off every year as the low person in the Madison District in social studies caused me to get my master's in literacy, and they stopped laying me off, so I just stayed there and found it real interesting. For about a decade, I was the struggling reader guy at East, so I have deep experiences with those kinds of issues. I coordinated a peer tutoring program for quite a while with kids who were struggling across the curriculum. I worked as a literacy coach for about 20 years, and I taught a variety of classes, from study skills related classes to a speed reading class to preparing kids for the SAT and the ACT, which I am going to touch base on a little bit. You had some data that looked at that as well. So the last half dozen years of my career, I split my assignment. I taught at East in the morning, and then I was one of the two middle school, high school literacy support teachers for our 13 middle schools, 4 high schools, alternative programs, and so forth. So lots of different angles to think about this issue that I think are kind of fun. I also think it's kind of fun the number of times students left my classroom and came to Sun Prairie, or the number of times students came from Sun Prairie to my classroom. That became an increasing dynamic the later years of my teaching, that there was a lot of movement on the east side here, and students that you worked with at some point we may have worked with as well. So that's kind of the backdrop. And I'm going to center in, for starters, on one of the standards that probably didn't jump off the page at you at first. And when you look at that packet, standard 10 in the reading standards across the board is some variation of this one. And this is essential for really understanding what the real major, one of the real major shifts that's represented in the Common Core Standards in literacy. And basically, the word here that's the key word is complex. We never use the term complex text in our field, and it surfaced in an interesting place in a well-respected and very extensive report by the ACT in 2006. Was really the first place I started seeing people talking about complex texts. So when you look at reading standards 1 through 9, those aren't just neutral reading standards. Those standards are predicated on kids are reading some pretty tough stuff while they're doing the kind of thinking we're asking them to do, okay? So I want to dig at that a little bit and have you kind of think through what that might look like in the discipline that you teach. And to do that, I'm going to open with a little experiment with you, and I'm going to give you a chance to dig into a text that is arguably a complex task. And here's the task that I have set out for you. Focus on what you are understanding as you read this complex text, which looks like a duh task. What else would you be doing? I'm going to restate your task, and I'm going to vary my intonation just a tad. I'd like you to focus on what you are understanding as you read this complex text. I don't necessarily think you're going to understand all of it. Personally, I didn't. but I'm also assuming that you're going to understand some of it. Now, with my students in complex texts, what I usually got is, this was too hard, which means I'm giving myself permission to quit. So, let's not focus on what you're not getting. Let's focus on the parts you are getting. So what is it that this author is saying that you feel you are able to understand? Now, you can look at the text. It's on page, it's just an excerpt. It's on page 5 of your handout, but I will also project it up here. And I have to give you just a little bit more context before I ask you to do this experiment. This is me in real life behaving as a reader with a complex text. So, some context. First of all, you'll notice that it's from the New York Times a little over a year ago. The title is The Greatest. This author is one I had been tracking for a while because somewhat earlier during the year, he raised a question in a column and he said, who would the greatest classical composers of all times be? I mean, it's outrageous to even say that we'd come up with a list, but I'm going to. So, who are the candidates? What would be the qualifications? What are the strengths and weaknesses of each of the candidates? And he wrote like 8 or 10 columns, spaced out over time, raising different people and talking about them and so forth. I should mention I'm married to a violinist, former orchestra teacher at La Follette in Oregon and at Sherman Middle School, and a violinist with the Madison Symphony. So I go to a lot of classical music concerts, and what the hey, I might as well know a little bit more about what I'm doing as I satisfy my spousal responsibilities. I like the music, but I should be there too, okay? So I'm reading these. I told you I'm a history poli-sci guy, and I go to concerts, all right? So that's where I'm coming from. So here it is, the column where Anthony Tomasini reveals his 10 greatest composers of all times and makes his case for each. Number 1 is who you get to read about, and here is number 1. I mean, that's pretty swell hair, isn't it? I mean, I'd vote for him just based on the hair appearance. That's the backdrop. Me, with my background, with a sort of interest, who wants to see what this author has to say about the 10 greatest composers. I only gave you an excerpt of the first of the 10. So that's all I'm asking you to pay attention to. So here's what he has to say about Bach. And again, focus on what you feel you are understanding as you tune into this complex text. gradual release model, I'm treating you as wholly competent to do this absolutely alone. I assigned it. Good luck. I assigned it. You're literate adults, right? Shouldn't you be able to do this by now? Don't you love it when, shouldn't you be able to do this by now? I mean, you're college-educated adults. Shouldn't you be able to do this by now? I bet some scaffolding would be useful for a lot of you. All right? It would have helped me. So here's a case where we have a complex text, and we're dealing with a situation where probably you're pretty aware, many of you, probably most of you, that your understanding is incomplete. All right? If this were a classroom setting, here's what the research strongly resounds on. If this were a classroom setting, the kids do the assigned work or not, and then they look at you. And what they're telling you with their gaze, with their body language, and maybe if they might come right out and use words, is, are you serious? I mean, if you actually care, if I know anything up here, you better start talking. You better start talking. Well, that's kind of skirting the issue of you getting better at accessing yourself. What a nice deal we have. Every time it's hard, someone just tells you or shows you what you need to know. If you track that language in the standards, it surfaces again and again and again, developing kids' capacity to inform themselves without another person telling or showing them it. The capacity to get it yourself. How about when it's challenging? And when just behaving like a normal reader isn't necessarily gonna be enough. Okay? So that's underlying that issue, developing kids' capacity to access some of the knowledge and practices of a discipline without having someone else do it for them. They can inform themselves. And that kind of, in a nutshell, is what's grinding a lot of the mechanisms together for the standards. So I'm going to give you a chance to have a second look at this text. But in this particular case, I'm going to walk back in that gradual release model just a couple of steps. You know, I think it would work better if you had a collaborator. So rather than you do it alone as an assignment, we're going to ratchet back just a couple of steps and look at now. Turn to the people that you've been talking to. Maybe you'll be lucky and actually have somebody next to you who's pretty confident here. Turn to the people you're talking to. Spend a couple minutes, and I have two tasks for you. The first task is share what you felt you did understand. So go through the text and talk through with your partner the parts that the author told you that you felt, okay, now here's where I think I understood something. That's the first task. The second task is, as a team, go to places where you're not sure what the author said and see if you can work out a deeper understanding. So share what you got and team to try to get more. Just take a couple minutes and play with that a little bit and continue that work on this text now as a conversation. I'm going to interrupt your deliberations here. How many of you feel like this conversation has made your understanding a little bit deeper, or the conversation was helpful to you as you were thinking about what was going on in this text? That's like a no-brainer, right? Okay, you've just met Standard 1 in the speaking listening standards, by the way. If this were my classroom and an administrator was asking me, you know, what standards am I trying to mentor kids during this lesson, Standard 1 of the speaking listening standards is kids in conversation about the topics of your curriculum, using each other to work toward an understanding and to explain their understandings to each other. Not only are these deliberations, which you did a modest, just a small example of, very helpful for the task of reading comprehension, you are meeting other standards as part of this. So that's kind of how this plays along. Now, again, what if the classroom dynamic is you are responsible for understanding what this author said, you are accountable for what this author said, and I'm not going to tell you or show you. I think that would influence how you used your partners. I think it would. But if I come back to whole class at this point, now I have some options. First of all, who are the music people in the room? Okay. Why am I not going to let them talk? Because the rest of you, if you know that the handful of kids who already brought deep knowledge and have demonstrated that what they say can be trusted ahead of time, if they lead the conversation, you don't have to work. Now, you don't have to wait for the teacher to tell you. You can wait for the teacher surrogates to tell you. The handful of trusted voices that the teacher will nod and say, I didn't have to say it, we'll let her say it, you know, or him, okay? So if I were coming back whole class, I would likely, you know, look around and say, we don't have time, and this is no context for that. But if I did, I'd say, what's one thing you guys talked about that you felt you understood? Just take part of it. Start the conversation, you know, and other people can start to chip in with what they understood. Is there anything that really people struggled with right there? You know, what didn't you get there? And we start building that understanding as a group. You're doing the work. Well, that seems like it's going to take more time. In the short run, it obviously is going to take more time. In the long run, I'm mentoring you to do more of this yourself successfully without me always having to come back and tell you or show you. Otherwise, I can't trust that a lot of you or most of you got it. That's the dynamic. So we could dig in and talk about this text some, but I've got a second deliberation that I'd like you to just spend a couple minutes on. Earlier, the presentations looked at factors as kids go farther up into our educational system, factors that make reading the texts a greater challenge. Look at this particular text, and if you could just take a couple minutes and analyze it, and again with the people you've been talking with, if you made a list of factors that are in play in this text that make it a challenging, complex text for a reader like you to read, what are those factors that you would say, this is a challenging read because 1, 2, 3, 4, what would be on your list? So let me just give you maybe a minute or two to dig in and look at, so why is this hard for so many people? What's the challenge? What's the complexity? Take a couple moments and take another look at the text. I'm hearing a lot coming out here. Just to kind of get a quick sense of what you're picking up here, could I get some volunteers to share, like what's one thing you talked about that you think is in play in this text that makes it a complex text to read? Hayden. Okay, here we got Hayden right up here. So there are references to people or things or perhaps events. There are references that you lack some knowledge in here. By the way, that kind of complexity is very typical of history texts. A lot of the challenging vocabulary are words that are proper nouns and have capital letters in them. And you can say, well, is Hayden a vocabulary word? Why, yes, it is. It's an interesting kind of vocabulary word. And if you know nothing about Hayden, for instance, he's Haydn, then look what that does. Okay, so it looks like Hayden to me, except if I knew differently. And if you said Haydn, how do you get that out of it? So I don't know. But so there are references in this text that are references that might not be clear to you, and that was nicely established. So give me something else that was that you noticed that was a element of complexity. Sure. Yeah, and actually, the part of the challenge here is, so I read it, now what? And you could operate at a number of different levels. I could ask you to analyze a piece of his music using some of what the author said, or I could say, what's a general sense here? And to the extent to which the task allows you a general understanding versus a very in-depth understanding, that makes a huge difference. The task we attach to the text makes a huge difference. What else did you talk about? Sure.
Instead of using, for example, an adjective, beautiful, how they use with it, austerely, so not. You can just say the beautiful part of it would be a lot easier, but by compounding it.
Look how often the author did that. String along a term of descriptive language, some of which is a handful. And you mentioned austerely. That's right from the start. That's going to be language that's going to be kind of challenging. Good. What else came up? Yes. I gave you him. You had trouble breathing some life into this text, using your imagination as a tool for this text. There were all sorts of things that were mentioned that for some people could, bring out all sorts of visual information, and other people are essentially reading words. Boy, is that a difference. What else? You're really digging this apart. My wife said she heard it. Yeah, she heard all sorts of things. Artifuge, she heard it. So you're saying that not only visualizing, but that this is an article in music, and you're getting into all sorts of implications that are instructional implications here, that to what extent would having listening be integrated with comprehending as a reader? Okay, sure. religious background knowledge. I mean, this isn't just musical background knowledge. There are references to religions, and I would say people who have some historical background knowledge in general, like me, had some advantages, even though this was more music history. What else? Anything else? Yeah. Really long sentences. 4 lines. This is so typical of texts that grow in complexity because they try to write very precisely and carefully and qualify things so that you end up with lots packed into it. These sentences have just to navigate where the author is taking your thinking, and then a parenthetical, a different thought is dropped into a sentence, and then you have to come back to the flow. That's clearly an issue here. Occasionally someone will count the number of words in a sentence, and it'll be, astounding how much is packed into a sentence. Yes? Yeah, a lot of the texts kids get practice on in the classroom, just, they take the main idea, they put it in bold print, they put it in the margin, they put it in neon lights, they practically scream it at you, and real texts may not do that. It may be more subtle, and structure may be, you may have to infer how the author's putting it together. We teach kids topic sentences, beginning and ends of paragraphs, and this author didn't write it that way. I don't know, we've just ripped into this a number of different ways. Is there anything we haven't talked about that surfaced in your conversation? I have problems with that myself. So you're objecting to the music speak here? Yeah, the vocabulary isn't just visceral and austerely. There is the insider talk of music that permeates this particular text. Fugue, what is a fugue? What's the form of a fugue? What does a fugue sound like? What are examples of fugues? Don't talk to me. That's not my depth. So some of you may feel you're out of your depth in terms of the music language and some of the music background knowledge. Sure. Well, he's making a claim that when you do all the work that he's set you up with his 8 or 10 columns, Bach's going to win, and he's going to make an argument that this is why Bach wins, and that is clearly standard 8, where you are picking up that this author is going to try to convince you that if you use the standards that he tried to argue through, this guy comes out the top. Sure. I can't imagine you must have been the most abnormal reader in the room, because clearly I sensed people who were just disappointed that the rest of the article wasn't up there as well. Part of the issue for you was that you felt a greater distance from what this author was saying than maybe some of the other people in the room. And does that ever happen in your classroom? How about daily? Okay. So, I read this text, and I still don't get some things. I don't get complex counterpoint. My wife has explained it. She's tried to exemplify it with playing music to me and so forth. I don't have quite enough background to really appreciate some of the things that were talked about here. Even though I think I have a sense that, you know, Bach must have been quite a stud. Actually, literally he was. He had like 20 kids. I think he was like a music stud too, okay? Some of you are, why didn't we read about that? That sounds more interesting. I'm gonna kind of pull some of our thinking together here. I read this text, and my wife read this text. This was an interesting text for me because I'm trying to inform myself more about music I encounter. But I found it challenging, and I recognize there are parts of what this author had to say that I did not really get. My wife read it, and it was a very comfortable text. So, she has stronger reading skills than me, right? I mean, if we took like standardized reading tests, she'd win, right? No! She's not better than me as a reader. I can wipe her out in all sorts of texts. The point is, she is a more proficient reader of this text. I'm a more proficient reader of other texts, and that matters a lot. It goes much deeper than our reading score or our Lexile level, and we are actually filming this for whatever purposes, I don't know. But if you watched this played back and listened to your analysis, that comes through very strongly from you as you look at this particular analysis here. So if we, let's go here, if we kind of summarize, and the last page of your handout gets a little bit more in depth here, but if you kind of summarize it, basically, the language structures from sentences to overall structure of the flow of ideas and so forth are very sophisticated. I mean, this author is making an argument. This author is saying the effect of Bach was, which is a cause-effect type dynamic. This author is using very sophisticated structures. Now, could the author have written this text using simpler sentences? He didn't get over it. Do we have to translate everything for our kids to simple sentences? And part of the push behind the standards is not, don't give this to your kids because of this. It's, how do we grow kids toward increasing their ability to handle being talked to like this by authors? Okay, so that's a particular issue. We really, I think, nailed that one in a lot of different ways. And I think we nailed that one in a lot of different ways. Here's a big one. There's almost a mythology about how you grow as a reader, so that you actually reach a point where if you're asked to read something, what you do is just read it. You just read it. My wife kind of just read this. Not me. I had to work it. That's a nasty sounding word for your kids. I don't want to read it, and now I have to read it and work it. It won't just come to me. That positions it in a dramatically different place. And none of us are so naive as to believe that kids are eager for opportunities to have to work at top effort to make some sense. And what about the interest variable? So what do we do with kids who aren't motivated? It's like that's always on the docket. I am not motivated. Put me in any of a number of these situations and I am not terribly motivated. Now I have internal ways of overcoming not wanting to do something. I'll mention a little bit of that in a bit with technical texts. But that matters a lot. So what if you have to work it? Working it means top effort, and interest and motivation are flagging. Why is it okay for a group of literate adults, many of whom dutifully did sort of what I asked you to do, but not at your best? Why is that okay? Why is it okay for you to kind of do it and your kids not to kind of do it? I think it's human nature. I think it's likely, unless we set up the flow of what kids do in such a way that we expect them to work it and we support the work so that the work is likely to be successful. I think that's a big issue. And this last one is huge, and it's one of the other big ideas for this morning. Was the text that I showed you an acceptable text to use with kids? You could say, are you kidding? That was outrageous. Use that with students. Now, I'm not saying 6th grade students, but if we were looking at 6 through 12, somewhere in that range, is that an acceptable text to use with students? And I think a lot of us would say, you haven't met my students. You don't know what things really look like in a classroom. Actually, I think over the years met some of your students, as we were mentioning, but that's a big deal. Okay? My wife would say, sure. When she was teaching orchestra at La Follette, she would say, sure. That would have been an acceptable text to use as part of understanding, let's say, a piece that they were playing that was a Baroque piece or a piece by Bach or so forth. Okay? So, what discipline is that an acceptable text? And for many of you, that is not an acceptable text in your discipline. Furthermore, if it's embedded in a discipline, you've been doing learning before this text, and you will follow it up with more learning. So a lot of the background knowledge variables would be part of the regular flow of your instruction, but being very aggressive about looking at, if you're going to understand this and I don't just tell you what it says, then what background knowledge variables do we have to make sure we've accounted for as we're leading into this particular text? A couple other thoughts here. Another eye-opener. We're just getting used to Lexiles. That's part of the language that's out there. And you know that a Lexile is a computerized determination that projects about how difficult a piece of text might be. And it's based hugely on how elaborate the sentences are and how dense the vocabulary load is. But of course, Lexile levels don't determine how much knowledge you need to have about the subject. That's totally not there in a Lexile score. Okay? This is, by the way, 1200. When I went to Lexile.com and plugged it in, it's about 1200. What's 1200? Common Core says 1200 is now about 9th and 10th grade. Are you seeing how the rigor part is really an issue? Because the assessments that will replace the WKCE are predicated on texts that are at a higher Lexile level than we've been saying. This is what we've always used. This is what I used to show teachers at workshops when we were talking about Lexiles. If you go to Lexile.com, you'll now see these new Lexile scores. And basically, the old Lexile range said this was 11th, 12 in post, and now it's 9, 10. So basically, 6, 8 in the old range, or a 9, 10 in the old range is about 6, 8 in the new range. It means textbook materials and other materials that are created in your disciplines, you know, they're all going to align with Common Core. So you're going to see the materials that you are purchasing ratcheted up a notch or two, and what's going to be frustrating is, wow, as I currently work with kids, we have challenges, and we're looking at texts that have an increased challenge here, okay? Now, there are some reasons for that change that I'll get to just briefly, but if you look at this passage right here, Do you know that juniors in high school were getting texts like this forever? When I worked with kids in the ACT and SAT preparing them for taking those tests, test 3 was the kicker. This is the current, if you go, unless they've changed it, the current ACT website, if you go there, they have a complete ACT that's posted that was given in the past. They think you've been reading about music in the course of your instruction. I mean, this isn't going to be a text you would have studied probably in another curricular area. Look at the language. This is just as dense with music vocabulary. These are kids taking the ACT on a Saturday morning with 3 sharpened number 2 pencils, a student ID, and a snack. And this is kind of a handful. Like I said, I spent 2 decades working with kids in the ACT, and they've looked like this forever. And here's what the ACT concluded in their landmark analysis of all of their data in 2006. 51% of the kids who take the ACT are prepared to read college-level complex texts that look like this, which means half are not. And it also means that that's highly correlated with the College Board did a study about a year ago. 56%, according to their study, who started a 4-year college degree got that degree. And if you looked at 6 years as a time frame. But we're real good at getting kids into college. I mean, somebody will take anybody. You know, drain their tuition for a semester or 2, you know that. But I asked our guidance counselors when that data came out, do we have any data on the percentage of East High kids who actually get the degree? And they were aghast. Oh God, why would we want to know that? All your data tells you got them in the door. And colleges are pushing back and saying, kids think that the only way you're going to access a discipline is by being told it or shown it. And we expect parts of it to be kids develop their own access points. The kids are able to inform themselves. So, you really think this is easier than what I was reading about Bach? I think this could be harder. Now, Appendix B of the standards has examples of texts from all sorts of different disciplines that they think are grade level kinds of complex texts. So I went to Appendix B of the standards and I said, so what are they doing with music in the standards? And look what I found. 9th, 10th grade difficulty level text according to the standards. It's from a book on composers, and look how the standards are visualizing talking to kids using the kind of variables. Actually, my wife and I have developed a lesson on pneumatic notation, on neumes, with a short text. And we did a short text. We did 3 paragraphs, but it was kind of fun. And speaking of my wife, she used this text with middle school kids when she was at Oregon Middle School. Where's it from? The New Groves Dictionary of Music. Hey, you're studying music. Let's go to a serious place that music people value. And her middle school kids were working this text. There's a lot going on here. Historical knowledge of the plague, Yiddish, and some other kinds of terms here. There's some language that's foreign language here. There are lots of things going on here, and she excerpted it, so she cut things. But basically, you can say, middle school kids were reading that. Well, not as an assignment. It was part of a lesson. It was part of a structured lesson that supported them, but they did the work. She didn't tell them. That's the trade-off you're trying to achieve here. By the way, my wife was ecstatic to see music examples in the Common Core. Strangely enough, she feels that there is frequent innuendo that as a music person, They are like nice to have and extra people, but really aren't doing the serious work that happens with students in a district. And she appreciates that she's included in this, that her discipline is regarded as a central part of these standards, and that, that the standards recognize and do not ignore that people use language in music. Lots of the communication is not through language, it's through another form, but people use language as part of understanding music, okay? So the transition I want to kind of jump to here is looking at what is increasingly being referred to as disciplinary literacy. And I want to touch it with what you had earlier. This kind of schematic way of looking at literacy growth, and it's in your handout maybe on like page 4 or somewhere around there, okay? Researchers who have been doing real serious, interesting work on this, this group was from the University of Illinois at Chicago, created this kind of diagrammatic way to communicate a kid's growth as a literacy learner. And what they tried to communicate with this diagram is that think of kids as having growth phases. The kids kind of have these growth phases, and then they're in another growth phase, and then they're in a third growth phase. And then if you think of literacy learning in terms of growth phases, it kind of helps understand how these pieces come together. Well, I'm not going to spend much time on this first growth phase because you're not the audience responsible for that growth phase. This is what happens when kids walk into a school as kindergartners, as first graders, and you think of all of the things that teachers intentionally do instructionally to help mentor kids on how written language works. How the alphabet works, how words work when they're written down, and you think of words like phonics and phonemic awareness, and you think, I don't know much about that, or I don't know anything about that, and that's okay, because you're not the people we want taking care of that level. That foundational phase, I like the term enabling skills, because basically what those teachers really focus on are all of the skill development and foundational work that enable a student to do what readers do, which is to receive a written message and make sense of it. Okay? We're not going to spend time on that. That's the foundation phase. The middle phase is a real interesting phase because it describes most of the struggling readers you meet. The middle phase is the streamlining, multitasking phase as a reader, where you can do several different things at once. No, you can't. You can't multitask. You can only pay attention to one thing at one time. Well, unless some of what you're doing you're not paying attention to because it's moved to automatic memory, which is processed predominantly in the rear of the brain. Researchers at Yale, who've looked extensively at this, have discovered that people like us who are real comfortable, proficient readers do most of the brain imaging technology when we're monitoring you when you're reading shows most of the actions in the rear of the brain. So much of what these kids have to think about, you don't have to think about. It's an automatic processing. Wow, that frees you to be critical. It frees you to say, wow, that's totally different than what I thought before. I've got some questions about this. I've got some theories about this. I've got some hunches about that. It frees the frontal lobe to do all of those kinds of thinking that we tend to call comprehension, really. Okay, so a key word here you think of as fluency. You're able to do all of these things more smoothly and more rapidly. Okay, not just read the words with intonation accurately, but you're doing lots of different skills and strategies as a bundle of concerted action. Another big thing here is vocabulary growth. These kids predominantly learn to read the words of conversation. You run out of those at about 10,000 words. In fact, most words that we use in conversation fall within a range of about 5,000 to 7,000. And if you're listening to me right now, none of the words I'm using right now fall outside the 5,000 to 7,000 most frequently used words, unless I dropped in austerely, or visceral, or predominant, or words like that. You don't hear them very often in conversation. So vocabulary growth here focuses on the more precise language that authors use, words that are harder to learn because you're not likely to hear them in conversation. Okay? You know your struggling readers? They can read conversation language just fine. What they have trouble with is all of the language that's the more precise, specific words of print texts. So, when you talk about kids in this growth phase, and again, it includes lots of comprehension work that builds in here. Certainly, there's tons of comprehension work going on here. But this middle growth phase, here's where we say, what if you got a classroom and kids are at different growth phases? What do you mean, what if? You do. I mean, that's reality, okay? So then you start talking about how we support kids in this growth phase as we've got a range of kids in the classroom. These discussions focus on that. What if some kids need more instruction? Well, we've got people trained to do that. It's not you, but it's people who here need just more time and instruction. And the third issue is you. It's what kinds of structures can I put around a text that support your working the text to try to understand it. Now, outside of school, a scaffold, if you see scaffolding, you see it's usually used by construction people. A scaffold is a structure that construction folks put up that enables them to do work they could not do without the structure. And then when they're done doing the work, they take the structure down. Scaffolds are supposed to be temporary. So we do want to be able to say, here it is, read it. But in the meantime, the gradual release model says, I bet a lot of kids haven't developed the capacity to be able to do that at this point. We need more support as part of that. All right, that kind of conversation we've had a lot. The big area here is the disciplinary literacy part. I could describe that in the following way. The kind of thinking in a disciplinary manner that sometimes means reading in a disciplinary manner, writing in a disciplinary manner, speaking and listening in a disciplinary manner. Okay? When my wife read that Bach excerpt, she was kind of into her disciplinary lens. She was able to draw on rich disciplinary knowledge and vocabulary and experiences and enliven that text as well as inform her reading of that text so that she was able to successfully comprehend it. I needed more mentoring to do that. And you know what? A reading teacher could not have taught me how to read that text better. You couldn't have put me in somebody's class that was a reading development class and have the goal being I could read that text better, because I wouldn't have read it much better, probably. Now, I might have built some vocabulary, I might have known visceral and austerely, but I'm still in trouble. Because I knew austerely, and I knew visceral, and I still was in trouble, okay? So this part is getting to be increasingly the unique demands of a discipline and how behaving with language within the discipline starts to look different from discipline to discipline. This is all general work. This is still pretty general work. This is highly contextualized reading. How well do you read becomes, what is it that you can read well? And even struggling readers are better at some disciplinary texts than others. So the terms you might see at the top, certainly supports for kids doing this kind of reading, that's critical. And you can't separate behaving with language from disciplinary thinking. All right? So, in other words, I think one of the most challenging tasks for kids thinking mathematically is kids thinking mathematically as a reader of mathematics texts written the way mathematicians tend to write mathematics texts. Are you kidding? You care about me knowing this? You better get up to the board and start talking. can model that some for you as well, all right? So look at that top. It's kind of clean looking. I like the diagram, but I think the folks at the University of Illinois kind of made it too simplistic. It looks like everything comes together. It doesn't. By the time kids hit middle school, they are asked essentially to develop different towers of literacy. All right? So I've got several here. I've got a literary fiction tower, a math tower. I have 2 science towers because, quite frankly, when you look at science texts, they really start to play differently. A biology text is significantly different, and the way I behave with a biology text is significantly different than if I were reading physical science, earth science, and certainly chemistry or physics, okay? In fact, in Wisconsin, as in many states, you have different licenses to do those because of the vast differences. So thinking scientifically at one level, but thinking in a biological way is different. I have a history arrow. This is like a fake arrow. It's just a safe space. There is no such thing. What I needed to have was an economics arrow, a psychology arrow, a civics arrow, a cultural anthropology arrow. Tell me that if you can read history well, that means you'll probably read economics well. I mean, it's absurd, right? How about psychology? How different is that? How about civics? How different is that? Okay. Different background knowledge, different vocabulary, and what you do with the information and how you organize the information is real different. Many of us use technical texts. Some of them are in the form of manuals. They're online help resources. They're product booklets. They're directions. I'm willing to say that a lot of us avoid technical texts. And one of the big pushbacks from the workforce is kids' inability to inform themselves with manuals, online resources, instructions, and so forth. It's like you're sending us people who either we have to tell them or show them, or they fiddle with it, but they can't use the resources we've developed, okay? Health and fitness is another whole significant realm, and you can add art, music, and so forth in here. I think one of the most interesting disciplines is family and consumer education because it's so phenomenally interdisciplinary. Some of it looks like psychology, some of it looks like sociology, some of it is clearly technical text, some of it is more biological science type texts. It's a very interesting place to look. All right, so here's a little bit of the crux of the research here. Lots of people doing this work, and it's new stuff. If you look at the citations, they're like 2008, 2009, 2010. It's a mammoth shift of how people are looking at this third growth phase. These researchers looked at 3 disciplines: mathematicians, chemists, and historians. They got actual practicing professionals in all 3 fields: chemists, historians, theoretical mathematicians. They got college professors in all 3 groups, and they got high school teachers in all 3 groups. They got them together and they said, bring the stuff that you would read as part of your behavior in your discipline. What do chemists read? What do historians read? Bring that stuff in. And then they did 3 years worth of interviewing. They had a 3-year Carnegie grant and got an extensive profile on all 3 groups. Here's what the mathematicians said. Okay, when you read math, you read a sentence and then you stop. And then you go back over the sentence and you essentially mine all of the conceptual understandings that would be triggered in that sentence by the math vocabulary. All right? And then you read the next sentence and you stop. And you go back and you do the same thing. And then you link the logic of the second sentence to the logic of the first sentence. So that sounds kind of vague, so let me just give you a little bit of a taste. All right? Here is a middle school complex text. Some of you are thinking, do you have any more Bach? Because, you know. Here's what mathematicians say you must do if you're trying to understand this text. Now, kid says, just talk, all right? We are so helpless, just talk. And we're saying, look, well, I'll dig at this a little bit. Okay, let's look at the first sentence. Integers are the set of whole numbers, including 0 and their opposites. Stop! Go back over that. Integers are, okay, they're telling me what they are the set. Set. What do I understand a set to be in mathematics? How would I explain what a set is? What are examples of sets? Why is set a useful concept in mathematics? If I can't do that with the fourth word, I'm in trouble with the first paragraph. Should you know what a set is already? The author assumes you've met the word before. You notice how much math talk is predicated on prior math talk? And that every sentence up here is loaded with prior learning that you should have gotten? All right. Whole numbers. What do I understand a whole number to be? What are examples of whole numbers? What are non-examples of whole numbers? I wonder why the non-examples aren't included. I have a question here. Including 0 and their opposites. Opposites. What is an opposite in mathematics? What are examples of opposites? What is the relationship between opposites? All that's buried. And if you can't do what I just said, the first sentence won't make sense. So why do kids find the first sentence hard if everything in it has been previously taught? Well, you don't have to learn it because somebody just keeps telling you and showing you. Except when you leave the classroom, I can't do any of my math work. Why don't you kind of review what we did? You've got a book. Are you kidding? I can't resource for myself. I can't resource for myself. I have to have a person talking to me all the time. I can't do it. I don't think you can learn math if you can't resource for yourself. And we give them nice resources, but they totally rely on us to talk and show, which is kind of what the mathematicians were saying, you know, that's not how you behave if you're reading mathematics. I would recommend that you do not read a short story the way mathematicians read math. You laugh, but you've probably been mentored in how to read a short story. And we probably say, well, we've had reading lessons, and often they're with narrative text or fiction, so shouldn't you be able to read texts in other disciplines? How come the research never shows that happens? If you've been mentored how to read narrative text, you will be better at reading narrative text. And most of us don't use narrative text. In fact, most of us use information text that isn't structured that way. The chemists said constant back and forth between the abstraction of the ideas and concepts and how you would picture it, visualize, demonstrate it, model it, find an application somewhere in your life, constantly going back and forth between the abstraction and trying to come up with some sort of, really enlivening it and seeing what that looks like. And furthermore, the chemistry people said, when you read science, you always are looking for what they claim to be so and what their case is, what the logic is, what the evidence is, what the work is that leads us to that point. So basically, we're claiming that this phenomenon is how it is, and this is why we think that. To be able to explain when you're reading science is huge. And it's one of the first two writing standards, explaining. It's also a speaking, listening standard, but forcing kids to explain their understanding in writing is huge. The historians were real different. They're listening and they said, well, the first thing we want to know is who's talking to us. Whose history is this? Who are you who's telling us all this stuff? What are your beliefs? What have your experiences been? What are your ideas about things? What are your attitudes about things? What are your prejudices about things? Do you have biases about things? We all do. We all do. You could listen to me and you can say, he has certain beliefs. Yes, I do. I think I could figure out what they are. You probably would. And if you're looking at what I'm presenting through a historian lens, you're really looking for where is this person coming from, where are the ideas coming from, and so forth. The other thing that the historians said, and one wonderful piece of research looked at this, is the historians looked at, they did a study, and this was done in Washington, at the University of Washington. They took 3 groups: high school students who loved history and were excellent readers, could have been me; college history majors, that could have been me; and actual historians. They read the same kinds of texts that would be texts you'd read in history, and the college and high school kids read them fairly similarly, but nothing like the historians read them. The college and high school kids read history as truth statements. The historians read history as arguments, standard 8 arguments. Standard 8 is like the show in history. Okay? Wow, are they different? Compare that with being mentored on reading literary fiction, which is, as opposed to all of these, an indirect way of communicating. Mathematicians, they want you to know something. You know what they do? They tell you directly. Historians, they come right out and tell you. Scientists, they tell you. But someone who's trying to communicate in a literary way tells you a story. You have to figure out what you want me to understand through the story, and because we all have different life experiences, we may come up with interpretations that are dramatically different, but all can be justified based on the story, which drives the math people nuts. So I'm sorry, there's like the logic is either there or it isn't in math. We don't get to argue over it. It's like, if we say this, if this is true, we can say this. No, we can't. No, yes, we can. You don't get to have a different interpretation. But in literature, that's prized. Look how different those disciplines play. Here's where I'd like to kind of have you think this through. The point is not that kids get equally comfortable in all of those. I have different interests. I have different depths of background knowledge. The point is that all of these are growing upward. For me, my technical text is my technical lens is my low line. I avoid those. But if I need to, I can. That's all I'm asking. If you need to, you can. I don't have to round up somebody and say, I'm helpless, tell me what to do. I can say, damn, I gotta go through the directions, and I wish I didn't, but I can. That's it, okay? So when you look at your profile, which of these are profiles where you are quite comfortable, and which of these are profiles where you are less confident? And the goal for kids is that in any of the disciplines that we teach, kids gradually develop the capacity to inform themselves in the disciplines that we teach without having somebody always being there to tell them and show them. I did some telling and showing, and you do too. I use technology, and you should too. I do interactive activities, and you should too. Some of the curricular areas that some of you teach, kids are engaged or active most of the minutes. But there are interludes, and my wife would say, I'm a music teacher, I'm not merely a conductor. There are interludes where we examine some things that inform our understanding of the piece we're trying to play. And sometimes that involves watching a video, but sometimes it involves reading something, writing something, and conversation around that. So that kind of balance, I think, is the big thing. So as we start to kind of look at transitioning into the gradual release model, and I've got this on page 4 of your handout, and I'm going to kind of send you into the small group elements looking at this particular dynamic. I kind of like this visual because for me it kind of helps me think through going from I don't really have a strong mental model of doing it well and what that looks like. Now, if you're a coach or like my wife, a teacher that does something with instruments that you can watch, then you can clearly model that and talk about what you're doing as you model it. But what if it's an intellectual activity that I do well and you don't, but you don't know what I'm doing as I do it well? So think aloud about how to think about texts that you're asking kids to grapple with. That's here. All of the rich vein of strategies you've heard about, that you've seen at presentations, that are in books, I've written about them, those are temporary structures that you can put within a lesson format to support kids to do work they couldn't have done independently, but you're going to mentor them to get better at doing that without giving it to them, to a point where we're at a point of independence. These are all facets of comprehension, and you know, I think we've mentioned nearly every one of them here. I mean, we made a lot of talk about the need to make connections to background knowledge. We talked about visualizing. Several of you made inferences about things. We talked about where the important part of the text was and how that was kind of challenging. And the whole point of your conversation was to try to summarize where you were at with something and come together. So what I'm leaving you here with are some pieces to think about. Page 2 summarizes these facets of comprehension that, like I said, most of them came up in your conversation. Page 3 is revisualizing the reading standards, and I've done a couple of things with page 3. The middle column you have in the other handout, and you saw parts of it modeled earlier by the earlier presenters. So the middle column, these are the anchor standards. They're rewritten for grade level, and they're rewritten for different disciplines, but these are the core anchor standards. And I've given you a cheat sheet. So on the left side, basically, look, Standard 7 is integrating visual information and technology with reading. Okay, that's Standard 7. Standard 9 is multiple texts that you read. You gain information from multiple texts and you do some sort of synthesis. That's Standard 9. Standard 4 is vocabulary development. I mean, it's a quick cheat sheet for you to kind of think through this will become second nature to you real quickly, but this is kind of a cheat sheet. The right side shows you where those different facets of comprehension link up with the standards. The word inference is in Standard 1, but there's some other facets of comprehension that are implicit in what they say in Standard 1. Basically, for instance, number 4, word choice, you often get into tone or mood, which gets into visual imagery and so forth. That gets triggered there as well. So this was quick. It was a little more than an hour, and it was literally the opening piece. I mean, there's just so much more that can be put together here. And, you've got, time to kind of think through how that might play out. But that'll hopefully give you kind of some angles on thinking about where you might fit in. And again, if you're a discipline that commonly, feels like this conversation isn't necessarily central to what you do, first of all, the standards are assuming that it is central to what you do. And the second thing is that it gives you, I think the standards have your back. It's saying, look, the ACT has music texts on it. I mean, who's going to do that if it's not us? The ACT has art texts on it. Who's going to do that if not us? I don't think you want to be left out. I think you want to be viewed as a core part of the conversation here. So I think that's a critical thought.
Yeah, thank you for applauding, because we are very lucky to have Doug working with us this year. I wanted to make sure that you all understood that this isn't a one and done with Doug. Doug's going to continue to work with us throughout the year, and this year we're focusing on having Doug work with our CLC leaders. So your CLC leaders will have 2 full days, one first semester, one second semester with Doug, to do learning about literacy in your specific content area, and then your CLC leaders are going to get to bring that back to you in the classrooms, in your department meetings, in your team meetings, etc. Our hope is that Doug will continue to work with us for at least 3 years, so we need to treat him very nicely because we like him very much. Yeah, you can't retire yet, no. As a reminder, you're going to leave here, you're going to pick up some more paperwork on the desks or the tables outside. You're going to get a map if you need one. You're going to find your room assignment sheet. You're going to get a copy of the gradual release of responsibility model if you want to. You're going to make sure that you signed in because we're going to pick up those papers and walk away with them today. So you want to be sure that you get credit for having attended this mandated workshop. And you're also going to fill out an evaluation form for us. Please take the time before you leave to do that. Just put them back on the tables outside the Performing Arts Center, and I'll pick them up later today. Doug's going to be visiting a few groups. I'm going to be visiting some groups. Rebecca's going to be visiting some groups. So we're going to do our best to float around and see what we can do to help you. Your goal is very simple. You're going to plan a gradual release of responsibility lesson. You have 2 good forms to look at, one that came in the first packet, one that came in Doug's packet. So you can use those. As I said before, you decide in your room how you want to divide and conquer, or if you want to divide and conquer. Now, since we first assigned the rooms and set them up, we had a whole lot of people register at the last minute. So if you are not on the list anywhere in a room, just find the room that's most appropriate for you and show up and join that team. Some of the rooms that we selected may be, quite honestly, not large enough for the number of people who are going to turn up at that group. So please just go into the room next door, break people up as best as you can, find a space and make it work. We know that you can do that. You do it all the time, okay? James is going to start a video for us here in just a second. That's the last few minutes. As soon as the video's over, we're going to ask you to dismiss yourselves and move on. Thank you again so much for all of your good attention this morning. Let's give one more round of applause for Doug, please. And I hope you have a great start to the year. So thank you.
We're going to try to keep this pretty simple. I'm very passionate about the notion of meeting students right where they are, because who they are is wonderful and who they are is full of potential. A lot of the patterns that we've looked at so far have kind of